Thank you.
So what we're going to do, the thinking behind this conversation is that we're going to start with research, and we have Michael Griffith, who is looking at the national scope, John Yinger, who's looking at national and state, look at policy, which we have Jim Talon and Deborah here, and then the practice, which is Deborah and Suzanne. And if we go with the analogy of a garden, our foundation aid formula is like Grey Gardens. It definitely needs some looking after. So why don't we begin with Michael Griffith. Again, he is a school finance strategist with the Education Commission of the States. Is there a remote?
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to see this many people here on a warm day in a semi-warm room talking about school finance for about 3.5 to 4 hours. Just to let you know very quickly who ECS is, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit organization out of Denver. We were founded in 1965 to help provide states with neutral research and advice about education policy. We have 49 states, 3 territories, and the District of Columbia as our member. Our only non-member state is the state of Washington. What I'm going to talk about today is give you a very quick, about 12.5-minute overview of everything that's happening in school funding in this country right now. I want to talk about some of the trends we're seeing, what formulas are currently in use, and how does New York sort of fit into all of this? How do they compare to some of the trends that are going on in some of the neighboring states? So first, this is the number I always get asked. How do we compare as a state to other states in spending per pupil? I always think this number is hard because I think any of you here will know, even though it's $19,000 plus for your state, it's very different if you're in Westchester County as opposed to if you're upstate. Your state has a very big difference between the lower part of the state, the New York City area, and the upper part of the state. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anyone. When you look at some of the other states in your region, they spend near to the same amount in New Jersey and Connecticut, and it starts dropping down when you go to Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. When you look at a map of spending per pupil, it's much more expensive in the Mid-Atlantic and New England states to educate a student, so that's where they tend to spend more money. When you move south and west in this country, you see the amount spent per pupil drop, with the exception of Alaska, where it's a very high cost area. 65% of education spending goes to teacher salaries and benefits, so regional salaries really drive the spending needs in education. Where does this funding come from? In your state, it's about 40% from state sources, 55% or so from local, and then 5.6% from federal. You're off a bit of the national averages, but when you look at the other states in your region, you're pretty much on target. Reason being, again, when we look at Mid-Atlantic and New England states, they tend to be more reliant on property taxes and local funding. It's the tradition of local control, as opposed to when you start moving again west and south, where you start to see more reliance on state funding and less reliance on local funding. When you look at the number for Vermont, that's a very unusual number. We'll talk about Vermont in a minute. They have an unusual funding system where the money is raised locally, spent locally, but for legal reasons is considered a state tax and state revenue. So these are the funding systems that are used around the country. And I will say, if you look at this kind of map that other people put together, another group might have a completely different set of definitions. These are sort of my definitions over the years as I've worked with states. And what you see is the majority of states now have foundation programs. Some of them look an awful lot like New York's program. Others, when you go to places like Texas or Georgia, have hybrid systems that are sort of part foundation, part other formulas. We call them foundation because they're more foundation than they're not. I want to talk quickly about the yellow states because they're kind of unusual and have some good stories. Hawaii is a single school district state, so they do not have a funding formula. They operate their funding as if they were a school district. Nevada has what's called a power equalization formula. The idea here is the state guarantees a certain dollar amount for a property tax levy for every one of the school districts in the state. It is the oldest school funding system in the country. It was adopted in 1967. They've made some changes to it over the years, but it's an old-fashioned system that stays in place because if they change it, a foundation formula would greatly benefit Clark County, and there's a political battle within the state where they don't want to do that. Clark County, where Las Vegas is, contains 75% of the kids in the state of Nevada. Wyoming has a school funding system that was mandated by the courts in the state. The court said you have to construct a school system that allows every student to have all the courses that they need to enter the University of Wyoming upon graduation of high school. So you have to construct every high school in the state, regardless of size, has to have all the courses necessary to enter the university. So every school has physics and chemistry and AP courses. Then they turned around and constructed the junior highs and the elementaries to feed into that. It was also done with the idea that the court said money cannot be an issue when you construct the system. Wyoming, when before litigation, was about 25th in funding per pupil. Now they're about 5th or 6th. When you regionally adjust it, they're pretty much number 1 on spending per pupil. Kansas no longer has a funding system. What you get is what you got the previous year, regardless of the amount of students that you gain or lost. This is part of an ongoing battle between the courts in the state and the legislature. Wisconsin, every state I go to says we have the most confusing system. One of the speeches earlier said there's only 3 people here in New York who know the system. The winner of the most confusing is Wisconsin. They actually have 3 different formulas that work together. They have a foundation formula and then 2 other formulas that they're all sort of combined, so it's a system that's unique in of itself. Massachusetts has a system that they came up with that connects their student achievement goals with their funding. And what happened is back in the 90s, there was a committee in the legislature looking at raising student achievement. And there was another committee looking at school funding, and someone said, why don't we combine these 2? If we're talking about student achievement in one, why don't we combine it with the school funding committee in the other room and come up with a funding system that will allow us to meet this goal? So what they've come up with is a system that is unique to their state, that changes in each district based on their needs, based on their enrollment, and it's based on certain categories that the state says are necessary for students to achieve at or above state standards. And it has really worked for them as a state. That from adopting that till now, they have moved up to the top of the table in NAEP scores on reading and math, not just for their general population, but also for their at-risk and ELL populations. Vermont has a unique system in and of themselves where each district determines what they want, what they need to spend within their own district at town hall meetings. And whatever dollar amount is essentially adopted, then the state guarantees they will have those dollars available to them. The states in the green are resource allocation states. This is a system that is sometimes called resource allocation, position allocation, teacher allocation. The idea is that the state guarantees a certain number of teachers within a school district that they will fund, a certain number of principals, nurses, and so forth, and it's done as a top-down system. So if you go to Idaho and you look at their funding system, you know exactly how many teachers are going to each school district. It's a system that legislators like because they know what they're getting, they know what they're paying for, but it is one that is having a lot of hard time right now as we're looking at things like open enrollment, if we're looking at dual and concurrent enrollment. It can't adopt to those systems. So a lot of these states are looking to transition over to a foundation type of formula. So one of these things too, when we talk about the funding formula, that doesn't drive 100% of the funding for schools. That just drives the largest portion in most states. And in New York, your state funding formula drives about 2/3 of your funding. You have another third that exists outside the formula that is sometimes categorical programs such as transportation, some capital funding, programs for summer school and after school and the like. When you look, that's pretty close to what the national average is. A few years ago, you would have seen New York probably outside of this a little more. You've moved some of your funding back into your primary funding formula. You've consolidated down some of your categoricals. And you can see Connecticut is one of the lowest states. They have a lot of money coming from outside the primary funding formula for education. So I want to talk quickly about some of the other categories that we're seeing, some of the issues that states are focusing in on. One of the first is at-risk funding. When you looked at some of the student achievement data that was put up there a little earlier about New York, we see this in other states. If you want to move the needle in your state, you're going to have to focus in on your at-risk student population. Your general ed student population, non-special ed, non-at-risk, tends to be performing pretty highly. It's the other students within the at-risk categories, ELL or special ed, that are performing below what expectations are. So states are starting to focus in on this a lot more. They're starting to look at other methods for identifying at-risk students outside of free and reduced price lunch. They're looking at things like density funding. We know as the density increases within school districts, the cost per student increases. And we're hearing more and more about wraparound services or community schools. This is the idea that these students need more than just a traditional school environment. They need nursing services, dental. They need things like food programs that exist not just during the school year or school day, but during the weekends and during the summer school. And so more and more school districts are starting to look at this. Some states like Kentucky have mandated that each one of their school districts provides these services within the school. Then we talk about ELL funding. This is something that's gotten more and more focus of late. Again, the ELL students tend to perform very poorly on NAEP and other exams, especially if a student remains on ELL designation for 5 years or more. Their odds of graduating and passing state and national exams greatly diminishes. States have found this. They've started to look at the research and they said, look, we need to put more resources in here and we need to find ways to move these students off of the ELL roles one way or the other. So some are front-loading spending. Ohio provides a lot more in the first year of an ELL student's experience to help move them quickly off the rolls. Some states like Arizona have set time limits of 2 years of funding, and other states are looking at a bonus to provide school districts for moving students off the ELL roll successfully. And we're getting more sophisticated now with our special ed funding. We used to say that, if you looked at state funding, right now every state provides some funding for special ed. It used to be that they did it for one category. All special ed students received the same amount of additional funding. Then it moved to sort of mild, moderate, and severe, this idea that we'll tier the funding based on a student's disability. Now we're seeing states moving towards tiering funding based on the services that a student receives. So if you look at Texas, they have 12 different categories. Tennessee has 11. Based on, is the student receiving an hour or two a week, or is the student receiving something much more intense? And then finally, I want to talk quickly about the states that have made large changes in school funding in the past decade or so. As you can see from this list, and I'm not going to read it all off, but most have done it because of litigation. If you look at states like Wyoming, Kansas, Ohio, Arkansas, they've changed their system because the courts mandated that they change their system. But if you turn around and look at Kansas and Ohio, after the court ruling a few years later, the legislature went back and changed the system again. Oh, thank God that's not my phone. I'd be very worried. But there are states that have made major changes without litigation. And they've done it very often because there's a leader that is pushing this. More often than not, it's been the governor, but sometimes it is a legislator. That they have additional funding available to make the transition from the current system to the new system. Reason being, if you have additional dollars available, you can hold everybody harmless and there are no losers. When there are winners and losers, we see pushback and we see that there's lack of acceptance to move on to a new funding formula. Even if those losers are the high-end wealthy school districts, there's still pushback. And then you need public support. You need to gain it one way or the other. And then finally, when you do it, and I'll say this, you have one bite at the apple. When you make the change, we've seen this in states, you can't go back 2 years or 3 years later and say, we'd like to change it all over again. The public tends to give you one bite at the apple. It takes about another decade or so for them to be willing to look at school funding again. And we've seen this in states that do something where they adopt like a lottery, for instance, that provides some additional funding. And it's an insignificant amount of funding to move the needle for education. But what the public will say is, we took care of that. We did the lottery a couple of years ago, and we changed that. We're not going back to look at education funding again. And I can tell you this from my home state of Michigan, where I used to work in the legislature. We did that. We passed the lottery. People to this day say we passed the lottery, why do we need more money for schools? Lottery money runs schools for about 5 days of the year. The other 165 or so are run by other tax dollars, but that's in the public perception. Anything I talked about today that you'd like to ask me about, anything you'd like to talk about for school funding, here's my contact information. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation or to kind of go over what I'm seeing. Or if you just want to talk about school funding, if that's your interest. Now I think Dr. Yinger is up next.